He's actually no stranger to the Cayman Islands. He came down in 2013 and helped us with our national sports policy. He gave us a lot of guidance and background on the long-term athlete development model, and it really informed the policy, so I'm really happy to have you back, Professor Higgs. That's great. So as I said, he has served as a professor and dean of the School of Human Kinetics at Memorial University in Canada. Professor Higgs holds advanced degrees in sports science, educational technology, and sports system organization. Much of Dr. Higgs' work has been in sport for persons with a disability, including the design of equipment, and this work was recognized by the International Paralympic Committee when he became the first ever recipient of their Sports Science Award. Since 2004, he has been one of 5 individuals working to fundamentally redesign the Canadian sports system to improve the quality of sport, working with 55 national sport federations to rethink the development of their athletes for enhanced high performance and also for improved population health. A critical component of this transformation has been the focus on physical literacy, ensuring that children gain the competence and confidence to engage in physical activities throughout their lives. Dr. Higgs is co-author of Canadian Sport for Life, Long-Term Athlete Development, which is the blueprint for change within the Canadian sports system. He has worked with governments and NGOs in more than 50 countries. His international work uses sport to advance the lives of disadvantaged youth and to reduce gang violence, reduce drug and alcohol abuse, and reduce the incidence and impact of HIV and AIDS. Recent international work was in Rwanda, including post-genocide tensions between the children of victims and the children of perpetrators, and I can't pronounce that. Azerbaijan? Sorry. Okay, sorry. Working with UNICEF to increase educational opportunities for children with a disability. This morning, he is going to speak to us about a new approach to increasing population physical activity. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Colin Higgs.
First of all, I'm deeply honored that you gave up your Saturday morning to come and listen to us, and I thank you for doing that. This was obviously the non-medical session, and I'm very pleased to have shared that with Louis. I come from sport. I come from high-performance sport. And the work that I've been involved with comes from a sad fact of Canadian history. We hosted the Olympic Games in 1976, and we didn't win a gold medal. We hosted the Winter Olympics in 1988, and we didn't win a gold medal. We won the bid for Vancouver 2010, and I was asked, along with 4 colleagues, to redesign the Canadian sports system for the good of the country. The reality is it was, please let us not hold the games again and not win a gold medal. And I have to say, Vancouver 2010, we won more gold medals than any country has ever won at any Olympic Games. And I take no credit for that, because when I got involved in this, I got into a big fight with the government because I believe then, believe now, that developing elite athletes and developing healthy populations are one and the same thing. We've got some problems. We've got problems with obesity and low physical activity. Now, I know which of the 2 people on the left of this screen is doing the most physical activity, but it's the people on the right. That picture was taken very recently in a Caribbean island, and it shows the dramatic change in obesity in the last generation. And this is a very recent and very serious change in lifestyle in the Caribbean. And everybody said, exercise is medicine, it's good for you. I heard that. I did a little tick on my sheet here every time somebody mentioned we should get people more active. Wishful thinking, because I didn't hear one person say anything about how to get that done. And that's the nub of this problem. So we tell people to be more active. In Canada, we have participation. In Brazil, they have a fabulous program called Agita Mundo. They have Active Australia. They had the President's Council in the US. And what did all of these things do? They had public service announcements and little mass walks and all sorts of good things. And where it led us to was increased inactivity and even greater obesity. The consequence, this approach has been a total public health failure. These exhortations to exercise more fall on deaf ears, and even when there have been positive results from these kind of programs, they've actually been quite minimal and remarkably short-lived. I think it's time to look at a completely new and different approach. How many here, it's a hands-up morning, how many here like to read? Good. Good to see. I love people who read. How many of you are good readers? Yeah. See, there's kind of a message here, isn't there? If you're a good reader, you read. How many of you are good at math? How many of you do math just for fun? So, it's a subgroup, but it's a different subgroup, and it's a hell of a lot smaller subgroup than that first group. But there is a message. We do things we are good at, and we avoid things that we are bad at. And that's the key of my message. If we want people to be more active, we've got to make them good at physical activity. Pretty simple. And we've got to do this regardless of the age of the people involved. And as a competition, if you can do that outside this room at the end of this session, then I am going to be really, really impressed. Now, we call this approach of trying to make people good at physical activity, we call it physical literacy. And so what is it? I'd say it's like other areas of life. Physical literacy is about building critical building blocks for later. Everybody in the whole system is familiar with literacy. What do we teach young kids? We teach them their alphabet and their sounds. We put it together into words. We put those into sentences. We string sentences together into paragraphs. So eventually, like all the people who put their hands up, we read books. And judging by everybody who's been on this stage so far, they all write them as well, because that's the end product. And I think that this is exactly where we need to go with physical activity. Why do we teach people to be literate in the traditional sense? Well, we want them to become better educated, we want them to have gainful employment, and we want them to engage in political debate. There are huge societal values of investing early in literacy so that we benefit lifelong. So we want to do physical literacy because we want better population health. We want to lower the rates of obesity. We want to build human capital. If you have not read it, there is a wonderful paper by Richard Bailey, came out earlier this year, on sport and physical activity, building human capital. Really worth reading. We want greater productivity. We don't want people to be missing work anywhere near as much as they currently do. And in the end, the one thing we really want is greater quality of life. And I wrote down at the bottom there, the best test for the likelihood of dying soon. Just because, you all want to do this test, right? Lay on the floor. If you cannot get up quickly unaided, it is the single best predictor of your likelihood of dying in the reasonably near future. Simple, effective, and it's about your ability to do something physical. So, a closer look at what we mean by physical literacy. I think it's part of an important group of literacies. In general, all literacies go through these steps of having basic building blocks, of reaching some kind of functional level, being able to use the skill well enough to use it in daily living. And in each case, there is a highest level of pursuit. And I want to show you some of those. We learn our letters. We put letters together into read and write. As adults, we can read newspapers, signs, follow directions. And at its highest level, we've got this ability to read for pleasure, write books, because we all get incredibly rich doing so. If you do, let me know how you did it, please. We're also interested in numeracy. Same thing, learn numbers, learn to add, subtract, multiply, divide. Daily living, we can do things like fill in our tax forms, make change, work out how long it's going to take us to drive somewhere. And again, there are people at the highest level who make a career of this. They're mathematicians, actuaries, a whole group of people who are very good at math and who pursue that math. In music, learn the notes. Learn to play simple tunes, play for fun and activity. Some people become professional musicians. And I take that same approach in physical literacy. Learn movement skills, combine these fundamental movement skills into games and activities, engage in sport, engage in healthy physical activity on a daily living, and those who have the talent and the drive and the determination and the money can pursue physical activity at the highest international sport level. And in every case, what we get is learning. We get the development of competencies and confidence. This confidence and competence in what we can do motivates us to do more, to improve. And at some level, we get to be masters of that particular activity. Canada has recently adopted a physical literacy consensus statement. It was done in June of last year, and I could very easily take out Canada there and put international, because it was a joint effort between Canada that hosted a conference internationally about physical literacy, and this same statement has been approved in a number of different countries. Physical literacy is about the motivation, the confidence and physical competence, knowledge and understanding to value and take responsibility for engagement in physical activity for life. I want to break it down a little bit. I come from a background where physical activity is critically important. Kids build tremendous confidence when they have developed and can demonstrate competence. Competence comes first. If we teach kids to do something, they do it, they feel good about it, and they're confident to do it. And yes, we need to give them knowledge about the benefits of physical activity. We've heard much of that in the last 48 hours. But the knowledge isn't enough. They've got to understand it, and they've got to internalize it so that it's theirs. And if we don't do that, we haven't gone far enough. And then in the end, it is that combination of the competence, the confidence, the knowledge, and the understanding, which I believe motivates individuals to become physically active and engage in health-enhancing physical activity. So it's going to look different at different stages of life. We don't do the same thing with 3-year-olds that we do with people of, like me, of more advanced age. So different people have got to be involved in this. And we've got to kind of break down the lifespan into some usable kinds of groupings. And these are the ones that we, and when I say we, I mean myself and my 4 colleagues who are trying to revamp the Canadian system. These are the stages of life that we think are sufficiently different that we need different approaches. Early childhood, have any early childhood educators in the room? Excellent. The most important person in the room, stand up. No, you don't have to. But if we don't get it right early, we pay a huge price throughout the rest of people's lives. Middle childhood, I'm going to put some ages around these in a little while. Then the late childhood, teens, whole different animal. It's just very, very different. What they need is very different from what they needed earlier, what they need later. We look at adults, and I'll break down adults a little bit later on. And then we need to go up into the older ages, into the seniors. And what people need at different stages is quite fundamentally different. In those early childhood years, kids need to master basic human movements. Standing, walking, running, rudiments of catching, kicking, throwing. In the middle childhood years, they need to learn the fundamental movement skills, to run well, to catch well, to kick well, to throw well, to have balance, to have coordination, to become more agile. In later childhood, they need to start learning the real foundations of sports. Now, generally, there is not a great deal of appreciation of sport from the medical community and from those in the medical side of things. But for many individuals, the only physical activity they get is through their involvement in sport. And if we can get more people involved in more sport over a longer phase of their life, we are going to come out ahead in this in a big, big way. We are not the enemy most of the time. Okay, in teens, I always get into trouble when I make my next comment. Being a teenager, from a sport perspective, is like being legally on steroids for about 3 years. Okay? You can't do it any other time, but body is producing all those natural hormones, and we can build on what that makes possible by doing the right kind of work with teens, which will give them benefits for the rest of their lives. That's why I, some of my colleagues, are absolutely ticked off that if you take steroids in high-performance sport, they give you a 4-year ban. Generally, when you appeal, it gets cut down to 2 years, and we know that those drugs carry a benefit for a minimum of 10 to 15 years, and probably for much longer. So, anyway, that's a rant. I could spend some time on it, some other venue. Adults, what do adults need? I'll come back to what they need and how it changes, and I agree absolutely with what Lewis said, that as we get into the senior years, what we need to do becomes quite specific, and it's generally around two things: strength and balance. If we've got those two things as seniors, we're in not bad shape. Well, where do we get these? We get a lot of these things out of the sports sector, we get a lot of these things out of the recreation sector, but we also get it in schools. And these schools have got to be aligned with the sport and recreation sector. They can't all go off and do their own thing in their own way, because there's only one kid, and he takes part in sport, he goes to school, and he's taking part in recreation. It's one kid. They've got to be working collaboratively. And don't forget, lady in the middle, the early childhood educators, because if they don't do it right to start with, we're in trouble. Where do we do it? Well, early childhood is typically in the home, in the community, and in early childhood centers in education. In that middle and late childhood years, it's really the schools and the community sport and recreation that are critically important. As we get up into the teens and adults, it's typically the sport recreation systems, community. It's also business, because this is an age where a lot of kids get into sports and activities, the outdoor activities, the kayaking, the canoeing, the skiing, the skating. These often offered through commercial operations. And so we've got to get them on side. And then again, as we get up to the older years, we get into the recreation system, we get into the community centers, we get into health clinics, and we get into, thank you, Lewis, the homes where we've got to make these things possible. And why would we want to do these things? Well, again, we've said it, for sport performance. I checked up how many gold medals you guys won in Rio. Wasn't a pretty sight, okay? But I want all this thing because I want to develop high-performance athletes. I don't make no excuses about that. That's what I do. But we also need it because we want health and social inclusion. Those are critically important determinants of how well people age. We also want it to build durability. We want to build resilience. And above all, and this is where I keep on hanging my hat, we want to improve people's quality of life across the lifespan. So in Canada, we started doing something called long-term athlete development. And for this particular audience, I would cross out athlete and I would say participant. I use the word athlete, and when I say athlete, I mean everybody from the 3-year-old kicking a ball around to the 93-year-old kicking a ball around, at the other end of the spectrum. For me, it's all-encompassing. Too many people think of it as only that high-performance stream. So when I say athlete, think somebody taking part in some activity. Active start, first 6 years of life. You had more brain cells working when you were 6 than at any time before or after. The ones you didn't use after age 6 got chopped out. Use it, lose it. And so we use this as a marker. By the age of 6, most kids have learned most of the basic human movements reasonably well. Middle childhood is from, we call it the fundamental stage, learning the fundamental movement skills, the ABCs, agility, balance, coordination. All of the other fundamental movement skills, kicking, catching, throwing, jumping, hopping, skipping, all of those. And that's from about age 6 to about age 8 in girls, and about age 9 in boys, because girls are already developing much faster. Again, we heard that from Mike yesterday about this difference between the boys and girls. We take this into account. Late childhood is from about age 8 or 9, and I say 11 or 12, but I actually don't mean 11 or 12. I mean until the start of the adolescent growth spurt. And that might occur at 9, it might occur at 15. And it is occurring earlier and earlier in almost all communities. Some lovely data out of Norway. Girls in 1790, age of their first menstrual period, 17. Average age. We're down to about 11 years and 4 months in North America right now, and it's only showing a small sort of leveling out. And why is it so young? It's a question that's worth looking at. It's so young, in large part, because girls are fatter. Human body can sustain a pregnancy at about 104 pounds of body weight. Don't know why it's 104 pounds, don't care. But if you are overweight or obese and you hit that body weight younger, then your whole reproductive cycle starts kicking in. Would it be a good idea if we could postpone this? Yeah, it would be a really good idea. Why? Because early onset of menstruation is a good predictor, I hate to say it, of early engagement in sexual activity, early pregnancy, increased drug use, increased smoking, and increased dropping out from school. So to push it back a year or two by keeping body weight down is part of what I would consider a comprehensive health type approach. I've drawn a line above this age because this is the onset of adolescence. And after that, we're pretty much into 3 stages that I take responsibility for, but you probably do not, which is the development of high-performance athletes. But for everybody, we want them to go from these first 3 stages into being physically active for life. And so ignore that on the top left-hand side. It's part of our overall plan, but for health conferences, for education conferences, for recreation conferences, I say we've got the same 3 building blocks, and then it also leads into people being active for life. The importance of starting off right. Thank you for being an early childhood educator. You are the most important person in this room. We got to teach these basic human movements, or that's a lie. We have to help kids learn basic human movements, then the fundamental movement skills, and then foundation sports skills. The latest thinking is that this needs to also be encompassed in a lifespan approach. In the very early years, we need to focus on developing executive function in kids, and we can do it exceptionally well through physical activity and sport involvement. Even though this is mostly a brain development, it can be developed tremendously well through sport and physical activity. Then we want to go on and do the fundamental movement skills and then the foundation sports skills. But I want to talk a little bit about executive function. From a physical activity component perspective, there are three components. Working memory. How do you increase working memory? How do you increase cognitive flexibility? How do you increase self-regulation and inhibition control? And what is working memory? The ability to hold multiple bits of information in your brain at the same time. There's an air traffic controller. Would you like him to forget where one of these aeroplanes are? No. Okay, he's got to keep track of all of them. Games for young children have a tremendous amount of opportunity for them to have to keep track of the other people around them. That's a huge part of playing games. And so we can help develop this working memory in young children, which is fundamentally complete by about age 6. If you haven't got good working memory by about age 6, you are going to have a deficit probably for the rest of your life. We've got to encourage cognitive flexibility, the ability to switch easily and quickly between different ways of thinking, different ways of seeing things, or seeing things from a different perspective. It's also about adapting behavior very quickly. How many kids' games require the child to think about and control their own internal environment, but also keep watch on what's going out around them? How many of you have seen this game? I'm sure it's universal, where you have one person stands, like me, with their back to all the rest of the people. And they're some distance away. And they have to creep forward. And if I, as the person at the front, turn around and see them move, they're out. Is that a game that many of you played? What has that kid got to be doing to play that game? That kid creeping up has got to think about their own internal environment, how fast, how much to move, and they've got to also focus on this external environment of, is this person at the front going to spin around? I'm working on a big project right now which is called The Wisdom of Traditional Games Around the World. And I'm actually looking at traditional games from all around the world and seeing how much of it is actually focused for young children on building executive function, even though probably 99.99% of the people have no idea what the heck executive function is. From environments over long periods of time, people have developed the games that do kids the most good. And here I'm going to go on a preaching rant again, and we take that out of almost all youth sport, because we regulate it, we conduct it in such a way that people do what we tell them to do when they are told to do it, and we are taking this building of executive function, including assessment of risk, out of kids' lives. Inhibition control, this is one I like the best of all. It's the ability to interrupt an automated response and control the body, and to resist distractions. And I love the marshmallow test. Okay? Now, do you think these kids here are having trouble resisting eating that marshmallow? Yes. Well, here's the test. Here's the test. You get kids at this age, and they're probably 4, and you give them a plate with a marshmallow on it. I know you're going to try this later on, okay? So if you've got kids this age, try it. You put a marshmallow on it, and you say, kid, you can have that marshmallow. It's yours. But I'm going to leave the room, and I'm going to come back in 15 minutes. And if that marshmallow is still there, I'm going to give you 2. And then you leave the room. And this is what the kid is going through. What is fascinating, this test came out of Stanford University in the late 70s. What is fascinating is that the early kids who did this test have been tracked all the way through to adulthood. And the result of this test is an incredibly good predictor of how well they did in school, in business, and in life. This is a huge activity. But it's what we develop in games. You can do this, got to follow this rule, and if you do, then this will happen later on. We can develop in a practical way in physical activity. And I think we have got to think this way as we go forward. Physical literacy needs to be inclusive. By that, I mean that there should be no barriers in the physical environment. Thank you. We've heard much about that. Don't need to say more. No barriers in communication. To get people involved in physical activity, and I've worked with athletes with a disability for 40-odd years. I have a terrible time personally dealing with cerebral palsy athletes who have communication problems, who cannot speak clearly. It makes me incredibly anxious and frustrated that I cannot hear them and I have to ask them to repeat themselves. I know this is, for me, is a barrier if I'm working with kids like that. In Canada, we're going through a lot of interesting sport activities now, trying to integrate Syrian refugees into our communities. And if we've got communication barriers, it makes it much harder. We also have no barriers in programming. If we want kids to be involved, we've got to have no barriers. It's got to be the activities they want, where they want them, not the activities we think they should be doing, where we're offering them. We've got to go to where they are. And I would say over and above all of those, the single greatest barrier is barriers of attitudes. Nothing working with new Canadians, working with kids with disabilities is rocket science. It's about a willingness to just roll up your sleeves, get in there and say, what can we do to make this work? So we get rid of those barriers, we will have inclusive physical activity. So we've got to do a few things. We've got to engage in developmentally appropriate activities, things that are right for the right age of the kids. We've got to give kids the opportunity to try and fail without fear of being judged. Nobody learned anything worthwhile without failing at it a few times along the way. And if we are judging kids because they failed at doing it the first or second time they try, we are putting them off for life. We need to help them if they fall behind. I want to say more about that later on, but most of all, we've got to make kids feel included in the activity. So early on, we want to develop physical literacy, which is building this self-regulation, working memory, cognitive flexibility. A little later on, we want to be developing this competence to take part in physical activity, confidence to take part in physical activity. And I believe that that will give us a way of getting to the kids, to get them to have a desire and the motivation to, in fact, be engaged in physical activity for life. I think we've got to do it in a whole range of different things. We've got to do it on land, in the air, in water. And because I'm Canadian, I got to put snow and ice in the bottom left-hand corner, which probably is not that relevant to people in this room. But we've also got to look at the different things we're trying to develop: body control, locomotor, the ABCs, agility, balance, coordination, and object control. If you're not good at something, it takes away a whole group of activities that you might want to engage in. If you can't run, you're probably not going to play soccer, football, basketball, volleyball, track or field. If you can't throw, there's a whole bunch of games that you won't be able to play. And if you can't swim, there's a whole range of physical activities that you are going to be precluded from taking part in. If you miss fundamental movement skills, you are going to have difficulty finding the activities that will suit you as you go through life. I also want to focus on what I call a huge social component. And I'm going to use an example of riding a bike. I want you to think back to when you learned to ride a bike. How old were you? Who was 1? 2? 3? 4? 5? 6? 7, 28, 29, yeah, okay. I want you to think about these 3 kids. They've just learned to ride their bikes, and this kid didn't learn to ride. What are those 3 kids on the bikes going to do? They're going to say, we're going for a ride. Come with us. No. Well, we're going. So these 3 kids go off, and what do they get better at? Riding a bike. And what does this kid on the right-hand side of the screen say? Come in for a ride. No. Why don't you want to come? I can't ride a bike and I'd really like you to teach me. Not going to happen. We protect ourselves psychologically by saying, come for a ride with us. No. Why not? I don't want to. I don't like riding a bike. And they fall further and further behind. And if they don't catch up at any point, that person is not going to learn to ride a bike. Hence the 28-year-olds who perhaps still can't ride a bike. So I want to talk about the learning sequence. At a certain age, very early in life, I said 1 for you guys, it doesn't matter how much time you spend putting that kid on a bike, they're not going to learn to ride it. It's just not going to happen. The body's not ready for it. There's an age at which they might learn, and I'd say that's probably around 3 years of age, where with some instruction you can probably help them to learn a little quickly. There is certainly an optimum age at learning to ride a bike, and I think it was pretty clear from the hands up. It's probably around age 5 or 6 that people are pretty good. And then there's an age where if we don't take remedial action, we are going to be in trouble, and this kid is going to get further and further behind. Early on, it depends on myelination of the nerves, on strength of muscles, but later on in life, it depends much more on opportunity and practice. And so I want to go on into adulthood. You can teach old dogs new tricks, and in fact, I would argue that for healthy aging, we must teach old dogs new tricks. And I think there are 4 things that are really important for healthy aging. One is physical literacy activity is critical. We know that the physical activity is incredibly important in terms of heart disease, strokes, cancers, everything else. It's becoming increasingly evident that it is a key component in reducing dementia. Ontario, where I live in Canada, has just finished a study which recommends physical activity for older seniors because it thinks it will reduce dementia and Alzheimer's impact by about 25% in terms of cost. And that's massive. And there is a good report, it's on the web that you can look at, that's got that data. And I think that this whole notion of social engagement in older adults is a key component to health through a number of different avenues that I'm not going to speak about. As we age, there is a need to change. Early as adults, we need to focus on aerobic activity and on weight bearing. We heard about, from Vera yesterday, about osteoporosis. When you engage in physical activity where you're jumping or bearing your weight, you're putting calcium into your body. It's like putting money in the bank. After about age 30, you start taking money out of the bank. The more money you had in the bank to start with, the longer you can take money out the bank before you're bankrupt. We've got to do that. In the Middle Ages, and I kind of look around here and I see a lot of people in this Middle Ages, it's really about aerobic fitness to strengthen the heart and about weight control. As it gets into older adults, it should be a shift to strength exercises, balance, and flexibility, because many of us lose flexibility as we age. And in the very old, which is people like me, strength and balance really to maintain independence. That's critically important, that we change our programs to reflect the greater need at different ages. We know absolutely for a fact that physical activity produces new brain cells. But, and it's a big but, just doing physical activity and producing new brain cells doesn't do you much good. Because what's really important in brain health is not just the new cells, but the connections to other brain cells. And we know that you have to have fairly intense cognitive activity to get those new brain cells to connect to all of the older ones. And so we have to make sure that people are learning new tricks as they get older so that we are, A, producing the brain cells, and B, creating the connections between them. Because just having extra brain cells is not enough. We need to add this activity to the activity. We've got to get creative thinking. And I think it's why learning new skills is so important. Physical literacy, this continuing to learn physical activities, helps integrate the newly formed brain cells into existing brain networks, and this increases the number of interconnections with other brain cells. And I put this slide in because I just think it's lovely. I love the complexity of all the interconnections that we have to develop in the brain if we are going to successfully age. And very new information, we should add to this periodic fasting. Now, this is really new information. It came out of the National Institutes of Health. Last year I got this information. And the image I have is not accidental. Being hungry, historical, evolutionary terms, is a major stimulus for thinking. Where is your next meal going to come from? That makes sense, doesn't it? If you haven't eaten for 3 days, you're going to get pretty interested in where the next meal's coming from. And this is what stimulates this connectivity in the brain. And so the current recommendation for periodic fasting is 2 days per week with adequate fluid intake at around 500 calories. I think you will see this come out of the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta over the next probably 12 to 18 months as an aging recommendation. But I just want you to look that both of those meals are 500 calories. Okay, the 500 calories done well is not a hugely problematic level of food. So, physical activity, new brain cells, more connections, periodic fasting. So I want to tell you about my personal physical literacy journey. I was born in 1945, and by 1947, in the middle, you can see that I was a brilliant cricketer. I had every intention of making the national team. By the 1960s, it was the only picture I could find of me in the 1960s. I was playing high-level rugby on competitive teams. I was in high-performance sport. Between about 1960 and probably about 2005, I played squash, racquetball, two high-intensity sports about 3 times a week, every week, and got no better and no worse over a very long period of time. Around 2014, I started to notice that as I was aging, my balance was not as good as it used to be. I used to do a lot of rock climbing, mountaineering, and I just found I didn't have the right kind of balance. So I invested $60 in a slack line. Now, for those of you who don't know what a slack line is, it is a piece of nylon webbing about this thick. It's connected to a tree at each end, and you learn to walk on it. Or not. And I want to proudly announce that as of about 2 weeks ago, I stayed on for 4 seconds. Okay? Now, I don't actually care that I can't stay on it, but I do believe that the constant trying to stay on it and trying to maintain balance is critically important. And I turned 70 at my last birthday, and I had always told myself that 70 was the right age to take up golf. So this last year, I played golf through the year, and anybody here learning to play golf? I got the incredibly important information for you. Okay, don't count strokes. No, there's something to count. Count the number of really bad shots you take each round and track it, because what you will see is a very steep improvement in the number of bad shots, which makes you feel competent and confident, and you have the knowledge and the understanding that you become physically literate. So I'm now old enough to learn to play golf. So across the lifespan, the process is the same. We need to learn. We need to create opportunities for older adults to learn new skills in an entirely non-threatening environment. They've got to enjoy. You're good readers. You enjoy reading. You're a good new badminton player. You will probably enjoy playing badminton. They've got to enjoy it. They've got to participate. We've got to make sure there are no barriers to their participation. Support from peers is critically important as part of that social network. And then we need to have people internalize it and do it for themselves rather than us exhorting them to go out and exercise more, a process which I think we've shown has failed. Summary, we do what we're good at. Let's make people good at physical activity regardless of their ability, disability, age, or culture. Provide opportunities for them to do what they're good at, and then I think we actually have a chance of changing population physical activity levels. My flight leaves in 1 hour and 55 minutes. And so I am going to grab my bag and I am going to run, and I would appreciate a kind of a little pathway out to the door. But I will just simply say thank you. That's how we're looking at it now. If people have got questions, put them through you. I've got exactly 4 minutes and 12 seconds.
Okay. We have exactly 4 minutes and